Morning, everybody. Today is book number 66, Mr. Tannen's Ties by Marianne Coco Leffler. One name on the cover. She's both the author and the illustrator. Mr. Tannen's Ties. They wrote the word ties out of ties. Mr. Tanen is the principal of the Lyndhurst Elementary School, and all the children love him. They also love his ties. Every morning, as the children enter the school, they check out Mr. Tannen's tie. It's a good way to start the day. Mr. Tannen has quite a tie collection. Funny ties, crazy ties, holiday ties, ties that play music, and even ties that light up. He also has a big collection of tourist ties. Anytime students go on a trip, they bring home ties for Mr. Tannen. His office closet bulges with ties. He changes his ties several times a day, depending on his mood, the weather, or what's for lunch in the cafeteria. On Frankfurter Day, he always puts on his hot dog tie. No one will know if I get mustard on it. If the weather suddenly changes, he changes his tie. If he's wearing his umbrella tie, you know that it's not long before it will be raining. And for his office duty, he always wears his red, white, and blue tie with yellow stars. One day, Mr. Tannen had an important meeting with Mr. Apple at the school department. Everyone in town called Mr. Apple Mr. Crabapple because he was always grouchy and never smiled. Of course, Mr. Tannen wore the appropriate tie. Mr. Tannen, Mr. Apple began, you are a fine principal. There's one thing that concerns me. What's that, Mr. Apple? Said Mr. Tannen. Education is a serious business, said Mr. Apple. Absolutely, agreed Mr. Tannen. You are a role model for your students, said Mr. Apple. Mr. Tannen nodded. Therefore, you should look proper at all times. Mr. Apple pointed to Mr. Tannen's tie. And that is not proper. And he handed Mr. Tannen a plain blue tie. From now on, Mr. Tannen, keep your silly ties in your closet. You're to wear only blue ties. Mr. Tannen was shocked. No sports ties with soccer balls? No. No tourist ties with palm trees and flamingos? No, Mr. Tannen. No light-up tree ties at Christmas? No, Mr. Tannen. Blue. Just blue. The next day, Mr. Tannen greeted the children as usual, but something was right. Mr. Tannen, your tie. It's just plain blue, said Alex. Mr. Tannen felt just plain blue. He said, sorry, kids. It's blue ties from now on. Strict orders from Mr. Apple. Maureen, said Carlo. How are we going to know what the weather is, asked Olivia. What we're having for lunch, said Kylie. Mr. Tannen shrugged. Shrugged is when you do this with your shoulders. Usually means, I don't know. Mr. Tannen didn't feel like talking to anyone all morning. At lunch, he wished he had on his hot dog tie. When the second grade celebrated Kristen's birthday, he didn't wear a special tie that played Happy Birthday to You. Alex was worried. Mr. Tannen's not the same, he thought. Early Monday morning, the school secretary phoned Mr. Apple. Sir, Mr. Tannen just called in sick. He'll be at all week with the blues. You'll have to come to Lyndhurst School and be the principal. The children were surprised to see Mr. Apple greet them at the door. I will be your principal for the week, he snapped. Let's have a straight line, no talking, no running. I miss Mr. Tannen already, the children whispered. That afternoon, Mr. Apple even made recess rules. No playing on the wet grass, he yelled. You'll track mud in the school. Recess was so fun. The children were happy when the bell rang. As they were filing in, they saw Mr. Apple climb a tree. What's he doing up there, spying on us? Asked Gailey. I can't believe it. He's bird watching, said Olivia. He actually looks happy, said Carlo. And that gave Alex an idea. On Tuesday, Alex gave Mr. Apple a tie with birds on it. Thank you, Alex, but that's not quite my style. When he was alone, Mr. Apple stared at the tie. Cardinals, my favorite birds, he thought, and he held up the tie to his plain gray suit. He couldn't help but try it on. After school, Mr. Apple wore his new tie to the grocery store. Hello, Mr. Apple, said the cashier, Miss Sweet. Good day, mumbled Mr. Apple. Lovely tie, commented Miss Sweet. You must like birds. I'm crazy about cats. And Mr. Apple smiled a little. On Wednesday, Mr. Apple picked up his mail. Then he sat at Mr. Tannen's desk to work, but today he couldn't concentrate. He opened Mr. Tannen's closet and searched through the ties. He found just what he was looking for. In the afternoon, he went to the grocery store again, and he got Miss Sweet's checkout line. Oh, Mr. Apple, now that's a charming tie. Mr. Apple and Miss Sweet chatted for a long time. What tie did he pick out? Her name is Miss Sweet, and he picked out the tie that's covered with cats. Because she said she liked cats. On Thursday after school, Mr. Apple thundered through Mr. Tannen's ties again. This time he heard music. It was coming from the tie. Mr. Apple headed to the grocery store. Then he got to the register. He pressed the tie. It played, Let me call you sweetheart. Well, Mr. Apple, I never knew you could be so delightful, said Miss Sweet. Mr. Apple handed Miss Sweet a rose. Would you have dinner with me tonight? Asked Mr. Apple. I would love to, Mr. Apple, said Miss Sweet. On Friday morning, Mr. Apple greeted the children wearing a tie with red hearts. Isn't that Mr. Tannen's Valentine tie? Asked Alex. Mr. Apple grinned. Well, I don't think he'll mind if I borrow it, do you? He won't mind, shouted all the children. On Monday, Mr. Tanen came back to school. Mr. Apple was waiting at the door. That tie, Mr. Tannen, grumbled Mr. Apple. Sorry, sir. Got a stain on it. Mustard, apologized Mr. Tannen. Well, it's a good thing. I bought you another one. And he handed Mr. Tannen a box. Mr. Tannen sighed and opened it. Big smile spread across the face. It's just your kind of tie, said Mr. Apple. Then Mr. Apple gave him a shopping bag filled with letters. The kids have been writing me letters all week. They want their principal back, and so do I. Thank you, Mr. Apple. One other thing, said Mr. Apple shyly. Could you lend me this wedding bells tie? I have an important date tonight. The end. Mr. Tannen's tie.